We live in a world constructed around gender, like not around biological sex, very clearly around gender and gender presentation. We're not, checking biological sex at bathrooms. We're checking gender presentation. So I think it's silly to sort of take the position that there's no such thing as gender or no such thing as being transgender.
Hello, and welcome to the Psychology Podcast. The following episode is part of the Making Sense of Sex and Gender series on this podcast. In this series, we try to make sense of the distinction between sex and gender, and cover trans issues in a very thoughtful and nuanced fashion. We have balanced discussions from multiple perspectives, including scientists, activists, and a leading feminism scholar. This series will hopefully expand your mind and help you make sense of the current heated debate surrounding the distinctions between sex and gender, as well as transgender issues. The aim is to turn down the temperature on this very heated topic and increase understanding and integrate truth with love. I hope you will listen to this entire series with an open mind and an open heart. And as always, we look forward to hearing your feedback and comments on our website and on the YouTube channel. So without further ado, I bring you this episode within the Making Sense of Sex and Gender series. Today we welcome Aaron Rabinowitz and Callie Wright to the podcast. Aaron is a lecturer in philosophy at Rutgers University. He hosts the Embrace the Void and Philosophers in Space podcast. He specializes in ethics, metaethics, and problems surrounding AI and personhood. He earned his MA in philosophy from Colorado State University. Callie is a freelance audio producer and the host of the Queersplaining podcast. They are a non-binary trans person. In this episode, I talked to Aaron and Callie about gender and trans issues. When it comes to transgendered folk, we tend to focus on extreme examples that are far removed from reality. Some people think being transgender is entirely a social contagion, while others reject the reality of gender altogether. Callie shares how transitioning has allowed them to become their most authentic self. Aaron sheds light on the issues of consent, autonomy, identity, and medical ethics. Both Callie and Aaron recognize that specific topics can negatively skew public opinion, which is why addressing misconceptions and highlighting the lived experiences of trans men, women, and non-binary individuals are crucial to the conversation. So without further ado, I bring you Aaron and Callie. I'm really glad to welcome Aaron and Callie on the show today. Thanks for coming on the Psychology Podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Now look, I want to say I enter this conversation with all the humility in the world because there's so much I'm trying to understand about this swamp of a discussion and all these topics and what are all the, and I'm hoping you two will teach me today what are the most triggering things I could, people could say, what are things to like foster a conversation without triggering people, and how can this be productive? So if I do say anything stupid today, please correct me and let me know what I have done wrong because it is unintentional. Yeah, I thought we could start with both of you just introducing yourselves and telling me what are you all about? Why are you interested in the kind of things that you're interested in?
Okay, yeah. So I'm Callie. I'm a non-binary trans person. I guess that I don't normally introduce myself that way, but that's like relevant to the discussion that we're having. So I figure it makes sense to just kind of like name the position that I'm in socially here. I just turned 38. I've been making podcasts for like 10 years or so. And I kind of have a knack for communicating with folks and helping folks understand things. And something that I seem to kind of have the capacity to do. So I like having these sorts of conversations where people are engaging in good faith because I think there's lots of unknowns about trans folks, right? Like the broader mainstream conversation around trans people is still relatively new. And there's a lot of people very invested in spreading misinformation and disinformation about trans folks and like what that life experience is like, what it even means and that kind of stuff. And, people who engage in good and bad faith, I tend to not mess with that because it's frustrating and rarely bears fruit. But people engaging in good faith, like I think it's important to just talk to folks and let people know, like this is what the real thing is. Because I think part of the reason that propaganda against trans people has been so effective is that there's just like a void of information that people are filling, as opposed to like a well understood cultural idea that people are trying to change. It's just like you start with a question mark and then you get to fill it in with whatever you want. And people tend to be a little biased, I think, towards like the first thing that they hear about something. And so it just creates this uphill battle for us. And so I like to, I enjoy having conversations like these because of that.
Cool. And Aaron, introduce yourself before I start with specific questions.
Sure, yeah. So since we're laying all of our identity cards on the table, right? I'm a cis het, half Jewish passing white dude. I, come from like a fairly boring middle class background and, got very interested in philosophy from an early age, even before I knew that that was what it was. And I'm into a lot of things. I won't list all of the weird things that I spend my time on, but the sort of common theme is moral education. Like Callie, I really enjoy communicating ideas to people, and especially I've found that I really enjoy teaching about ethics and helping people think through really complicated ethical topics. I find that a lot of the folks that I talk to have never gotten any kind of proper moral education. Either they got like a religious upbringing or they got, whatever secular culture has for moral education these days, which is almost nothing. And so they just feel like they have any of the language that they would need to deal with a lot of issues. So it's a real fun experience. I'm particularly obsessed with the issue of luck, and that's the only time I'll say that word, hopefully in the next hour, because I just spent the past several weeks writing about it for qual exams.
Yeah.
Conspiracy theories, especially anti-Semitic conspiracism, is something I'm very interested in, and misinformation in general, and also ethics leads to, concern about things like LGBTQ rights, obviously, but also I come from a lifetime theater background. So I grew up, even though I'm cis, around a lot of individuals who were, gender nonconforming before we knew what that word meant. And like, I know multiple people who have vastly more than the like normal average people who have transitioned from living in theater or who are in some ways non-binary. I care a lot about them and their experiences. And, I think it's really important to make sure that they are getting what they need in this world while also, addressing the concerns of people who, like Callie said, are coming to this new and fresh because, you mentioned at the beginning that like call you out if you get anything wrong. Like, everybody gets things wrong. I have misgendered people. I still misgender people. I probably sometimes accidentally misgender Callie because it's just, we do these things. And
you remain friends with each other. So that's awesome.
Right. And the important thing is that you don't do it intentionally. You recognize when you've done it, you acknowledge it, you apologize, or you get better at it because you become more aware. I've just switched. I use they more and more frequently with individuals unless they specifically ask otherwise, just because it's functional and to some degree. But yeah, I care about this for a lot of different reasons. And yeah, I'm happy to chat about, I also think it's really important to like try to turn down the temperature on this conversation while also taking seriously the various challenges that trans individuals are facing. I want to talk about genuine concerns about treatment, especially in for-profit systems, stuff like that.
So let me start off, Callie, just understanding you a little bit more and your interest in this topic personally. I want to learn more about your own personal experiences. So what sex were you identified at birth?
I was assigned male at birth. And I guess I'll just say, like, it's an important thing to know that, like, I am super, super open to having those kinds of discussions. Not all trans folks are. So, but yeah, I was assigned male at birth when I was 28-ish. So actually coming up on 10 years or so ago, I just figured out for sure that wasn't what felt correct to me in terms of the way other people treated me, in terms of, whatever messaging I got about like what that is supposed to mean for a person's life. Like none of that made sense to me. And I had not really met or been exposed to the idea of non-binary folks. And so I think what was going on at the time, this wasn't explicitly what I was thinking, but I think what was happening was like, okay, well, this box doesn't feel great. So of course the logical thing is to like jump into the other box. And so I came out, she, her, trans woman. And, there's an interesting social pressure that can happen when you come out in that way, because often you end up feeling very pressured to immediately jump into all of the other gendered stereotypes. And there's like a super deep discussion to have about gatekeeping even within the trans community and the idea of respectability politics, that like people are only going to take you seriously if you try your best to like look and act quote unquote normal. And I think I was feeling a lot of that pressure. And then maybe 4 or 5-ish, I don't what's time anymore. I just started to figure out that like gender neutral seemed to be the thing that actually resonated the most with me. And so that's the short version of how I came to be where I am. I've been taking hormones for 8-ish years. I had bottom surgery 6 years ago. So I had a vaginoplasty. And, both of those things are, easily in the top 5 of the best things that I've ever done for my own, like, comfort with my body, the way that I relate to people, like, romantically, intimately, sexually, all of that sort of stuff. And, I feel like approaching 40, I'm kind of comfortable in the ways that I see most folks. I guess if there's an average of, like, I'm generally okay with who I am as a person, accepting the, I guess, quote unquote, normal adult problems. I feel like approaching 40, I'm finally like there in life, having gone through all of that and figured all of that out. There's a lot of other things that I don't think are directly related to being trans, but have sort of come as a result of things that I've learned along that journey. Polyamory, non-monogamy, being very open about being a very sexual person, being very open about, almost being a hedonist, I guess, if that's the way to go. And to be clear, like, none of those things are explicitly connected to being trans, but in doing a lot of the unpacking about the things that I've learned about gender and, the things that make me feel the most comfortable versus the societal messaging that I got growing up about what's correct and what's not correct, sort of unpacking what was what in my head for that and figuring out where I sat. Like, a lot of that was sort of like a secondary journey, and figuring out gender stuff for me, it just led me to unpack so many other things about my life. And so that's kind of what's got me here.
Thank you for that. So within the trans community, I don't know the statistics, so maybe you can inform me. Is non-binary trans in the minority? I would assume it is, but is that correct? Do we know? Sort of, are you kind of marginalized even within the minority, even within an already existing minority?
Yeah, I think that's probably true. I don't know that there are actually good statistics about that to be able to say for sure, but I think anecdotally, I would say probably that's the case. Just based on my own experience and the experiences of folks that I know and have heard talk about it, I would say that's probably true.
Cool. So my research topic is self-actualization. And so I'm all about helping people in any which way they can possibly be to feel as though they're able to live their most self-actualized life. Do you feel like the decisions you've made in your life have allowed you to have more alignment between multiple areas of your life and multiple areas within you as well? The idea of alignment, within a self-actualization context is about you're aligned with your environment, you're aligned, and internally you're aligned with how you see yourself. There's 100 ways we can talk about alignment, but do you feel like you're maximizing or at least solving for X being alignment?
Yeah, honestly, at this point in my life, I feel like aside from mostly unconnected, like, mental health problems, like, I'm a pretty anxious person. And I think some of that is sort of the low grade trauma of, like, going through your life being very different from the people around you. I think some of the anxiety comes from that, but I also think some of it is maybe inherent to who I am. And so, like, there's little things like that I'm working out. But in terms of feeling like I am the most actualized version of myself, I am 100% there. And I think the things that got me the most, I shouldn't say 100% there.
I've never met anyone in my life who said that. So I'm like, whoa.
As close to 100%.
We need to study you more closely.
Yeah, as close to 100% there as I think someone could reasonably be.
Wow.
The ways in which I'm trying to figure myself out now feel pretty average. Like if I'm talking to the people around me about the things that I'm trying to figure out my life and the way that I relate to the world, I don't feel like those struggles for me are outsized in comparison to the average person the way that I used to. And what got me most of the way there each time was figuring things out around gender. And then secondarily to that, figuring out the way that relationships make sense to do to me. Like I'm kind of a relationship anarchist, and that's like a whole other discussion. But the general thing is that I'm polyamorous and I have romantic and sexual relationships to varying degrees with other people, and there's no like hierarchy within that. I don't have like a primary, secondary partner or anything like that. And I think all of those things kind of put together have put me in the place where I feel I've arrived at being mostly average in terms of the problems that I have along those lines with like self-realization.
Wow. You're like everything that Matt Walsh stands against. like his
pretty much
head probably would explode hearing everything. Well, not just, I don't mean to just pick on one person, but let's say like the Christian right, you know, like, or any set of humans, groups who are committed to as traditional, you know, as can be, would hear a lot of what you just said and their heads would just explode.
My avatar for that is my very, very Pentecostal grandma. I was her favorite grandkid growing up. And then once I started down this journey, it was basically like every time I took a step towards like, oh, this is a thing that makes me feel good about my life, was like a step into something that she absolutely unequivocally hated. And that's like a different pain point. And I'm lucky in that I've only had 2 relationships like flame out like that over gender stuff. Yeah. But yeah, that's pretty accurate.
Yeah. And I want to explain why I think that's a little relevant. And don't worry, Aaron, we will get you into this. Don't feel excluded.
It's okay. I also am hated by the right for many similar reasons.
Yeah, we'll bring you in.
I don't feel left out here.
We'll bring you in a second. But I think that this is relevant because these kinds of conversations are so hard to have as a scientist. Because you start to realize pretty soon that everyone's kind of committed to a certain ideology, that it's almost like once you start pushing it enough, even if you start saying some things that are... I'll give you a specific example because I did see a talk where someone challenged Matt Walsh on a talk he gave, and they said, well, actually, the statistics you just said are not true. Like, let me tell you about some scientific findings. And they kept pushing, and it finally got to the point where Matt just simply said, you know what? I don't give a shit about your scientific findings. There's never any scientific finding that'll convince me that it's okay to be trans. And I thought that was revealing. Look, I thought that was revealing. And I'm sure there are instances that a lot of people can point me to where they say, well, we see that among the trans community as well, where you try to give them some science, they'll say, well, okay, at the end of the day, I don't really care. There's nothing in the world that convinced me that a trans woman is not a woman.
Yeah, I don't know. I would push back a little bit against that. Because for me, it's literally just my everyday life, right? It's not really a matter of ideology as much as it's a matter of like this is the life that I live and who I am as a person. And I'm not sure that it's possible for there to be science to convince me that I should have a different experience of my life and the way that I relate to the world that I do, right? And I think that's a lot of times where the conversation gets lost is like, I mean, what scientific information are we even looking for when we talk? Because I think it's easy to throw out terms like science and biology and that kind of stuff. But the question I think really is like, what are we looking for in that? Right. Because I can tell you that everything about my life and my emotional well-being feels better when I'm on hormones versus when I'm not or when I wasn't. Everything about my intimate sexual life feels better post bottom surgery than it did before. So like, I'm not even sure how you would apply science to say that those statements could be wrong. You know what I mean? Like, I don't even think it's necessarily the right framing.
If I could piggyback on that, like, I do think there are like 2 kinds of things where people can either disagree or agree. And one of them is like empirical claims. You know, what are the effects of puberty blockers? You know, to what degree are they quote unquote reversible or not? Those are empirical debates for sure. But then there are philosophical debates, moral debates about, you know, what is the right ethical balance, for informed consent for minors? What is a woman, right? That's not a scientific question. You can say what is a biological female might be a scientific question, but the idea of what is a woman in the gendered sense is a philosophical debate that involves social constructs and a bunch of complex issues. And so I don't think you could build a machine that could answer the question, what is, what truly actually is the essence of a woman? I think that's sort of part of the point, right, of like the second wave of feminism. And so, but I also think that it's not true that everybody is Matt Walsh. I think most people actually aren't Matt Walsh. I think Matt Walsh
also technically true.
A particularly extreme, zealotous person. I think if you came to Callie or I with a study that said, look, here are really, really, really severe harms from using puberty blockers, that we would take that seriously. It'd be part of our ethical calculus in assessing what is the right treatment. We might still think that the right treatment ultimately is going to be a decision between patient and doctor, but it's not like we're going to be, totally in denial about it. There are certain people who will say things that I think get towards science denial about, the difference between post-pubescent bodies or the role of testosterone, stuff like that, where I think that there's some wishful thinking on the sciencey side of things. But I think for the most part, activists and non-activists mostly just want people to have good quality of life, and they want them to get there by not being sort of duped or sucked into something that isn't true. But we don't really have a perfect grasp on issues like gender and sexuality. We're still learning about these things quite a bit. And the part of the way that we learn about it in a liberal society is that we let people live their lives in a way that might seem like it's harmful to them from our perspective, but we think that they should be, free to harm themselves in those ways. And that could even be true for underage individuals sometimes.
Well, that's very controversial.
And I think where the discussion often goes astray too is the weight that is given to certain questions, right? Because I think for a fair amount of people who have the conversation from the right-wing side of things, when we talk about letting a trans kid be a trans kid, what they're thinking is surgery and hormones and puberty blockers and all of that sort of stuff. What is actually happening most of the time is a different haircut, a different toy, maybe different name and pronouns, different clothes, that kind of stuff. Stuff that you can literally just say words and change. That's what's happening most of the time. And anything else is, in most cases, already you have to go through so many different hoops and so many different barriers and gatekeepers to get any further than that. I would never say there's no possible world in which we could have a conversation about problems that are caused in that way. But if we're talking about the vast majority of cases, people are focusing on the thing that happens, to my knowledge, the least amount of the time. If that makes sense. Late-term
abortions. It's just,
right.
It's not the central concern.
Yes. Right. And in fact, I was going to make a similar point in distinguishing different topics of conversations. And I wanted to kind of start with the most general, which is just having dignity and respect for people who say that they're trans. I mean, just the most basic sort of human dignity level without going, and I want to cover all the more niche topics later on. I refuse to be pulled into the deep end just yet. But I refuse.
That's fair.
I refuse.
It's all deep end, so just pick your spot.
It's all deep end. Oh, man.
That's fair. Yeah.
Okay. Let me just step back a second. I really like something that Aaron talks about a lot in his writings. I don't know. I'm talking about you as though you're not in the room right now. But Aaron, I like something that you put in your writings.
Fine. Not weird at all.
Which is that you often talk about, look, do the benefits outweigh the disadvantages? Okay. What really are the disadvantages for, let's say someone who was identified at birth as male decides that wearing dresses and asking people to call them their pronoun she, what is the disadvantage to us treating that person how they wish to be treated in a way that helps them feel self-actualized, in a way that feels they're living their best life? I mean, who's that hurting what they're doing? Now, so let me just ask that question. Do you see any disadvantages there?
The most outsized harm that could come from that is actually the transphobia that person will experience from their peers. I don't think it's even something that is inherent to that person being trans. I think it's inherent to the cultural position that transness occupies in a lot of places. Like it's definitely changing. There are pockets where it's changing and it turns out to not be that big of a deal. But I think if we're talking about the highest risk of harm coming to that person actually comes more from transphobia and gender essentialism than it does from any other thing.
Yeah.
Which is like, that's the conversation I ended up having with my mom when I came out. She was like, I was so ready for all of the arguments that she was going to like try to throw at me. And she was just like, I just worry because like people are really mean. And I was like, shit, that's the only one I don't have anything
you're right,
to come back at, because you're right.
Well, yeah, and the answer, of course, is like you're better off being who you are, and even if society mistreats you, than hiding who you are in that kind of way. I will, I'll step in for the people who, would object more strenuously and say the real problem here is this is a social contagion. So this is the view of a lot of gender critical individuals who believe that like the substantial increase in people identifying in these kinds of ways is the result of a culture that is in various ways indoctrinating young individuals to think that they are trans, to think they, it makes them special, it makes them popular, whatever. It's a weird kind of actually the exact opposite of what Callie was just saying there, which is that like, this view that individuals can build up a bunch of social cred and capital by being trans or non-binary. And like, to be fully honest, I believe there are spaces in our society now, to some extent, I think it's a good thing where being trans in these kind of ways will get you treated better in some ways than other individuals. And that's like people trying to correct for all of the other mistreatment in all of the other places. I don't think it's ultimately what's going on. And I think very much like the concerns about gay panics before this, the vast majority of individuals who are expressing these things are, working through what they are genuinely feeling. They're not just trying to build social capital. And that, what they're really concerned about is they're going to get so indoctrinated early on when they're just wearing dresses and getting haircuts that then they're going to want puberty blockers, which are going to sterilize them and have a bunch of other negative side effects. And then they're going to want surgery, and then they're going to be lifetime patients at the whims of the financial, medical state, essentially. That's the most extreme concern that I see people presenting, is that they think, genuinely, some of them think that like giant billionaire transnationalists are like pushing the trans agenda for the sake of their own transhumanist goals and to get rich off of consumer body modification. That's the most extreme fear.
Yeah. I chuckled a little bit at the idea of gay panics. It's just from a comedy perspective, that's pure comedy. I think like
lavender panic is the correct term, I suppose. Yeah.
It's like heterosexuals are suddenly panicking. Oh my gosh, I'm going to become gay. Oh no. But I mean, that doesn't tend to be the case. It tends to be that gay people are like, I'm gay. Like, I know I'm gay. It's like,
right.
I feel like the idea with trans folk, I noticed you use the word trans folk, so I'm going to use the word, that same phrase. It seems like trans folk seem to know that they're trans, like they feel it inside them, and it's not something that, and it tends to happen pretty early. And I know that that's controversial because people say, well, that there's this panic or this social contagion in the schools, which is why it's early. But it could also just be that people are starting to identify who they are earlier, and kind of recognize, understand it more. That's an alternative hypothesis. Anyway, so the idea of gay panic is interesting. Yeah,
it is a product of our society moving slightly in the direction of being affirming of trans folks, recognizing that we exist and saying that like whatever it is you need in pursuit of feeling okay is actually a positive for your life, right? Like society is in some ways at least moving in that direction. And so, I mean, I think it makes a lot more sense that if you have a kid who is growing up in a far less oppressive environment around gender norms and stereotypes, that you're going to find kids are more likely to express the ways that they don't fit in with those kinds of stereotypes and boxes and stuff. And I think that just feels incredibly logical to me. And I think the fear that you're talking about, I think that's really what it is. It's fear. There's a base cultural idea, I guess, that, the idea that other people can live out gender dynamics in a way that I don't is somehow a threat to the way that I do things. That's a very pervasive cultural idea. And I don't, and I certainly don't want to paint like everyone in the trans community as somehow being beyond that, because I mean, I mentioned earlier, the sort of gatekeeping within the trans community. It's like, I'm willing to be as progressive as it takes to get to the point where I'm okay. But anyone who goes outside of that box is the problem, right? That's a sort of respectability politics you see play out in the trans community where, a trans man, a trans woman will do their best to appear outwardly to be cis and completely blend in, and anyone who doesn't do that is actually the reason why trans people can't get the respect that we deserve in society. And so the problem is other trans people, not transphobia. And that's an entirely other tangent to go down, but that is to say, I think it's a basic cultural idea that we sort of have baked into us growing up, that and I do think that reaction is often based in fear of that specifically.
And when we say fear, I want to be careful, because I think some people, when they hear, oh, your actions are based in fear, that's like a dismissive, you're not being rational and that's bad. It's not at all that. And when I talk about moral panics, when I describe these, I really do try to emphasize, I think the vast majority of people involved in a moral panic are concerned about something that's genuine, whether that's the well-being of children or something. They may have a disgust reaction towards trans individuals, but I don't think they are like Matt Walsh for the most part. I think most of them are just genuinely worried that, like, maybe doctors are pushing, treatments on patients that they shouldn't be, or, there are excesses or not enough gatekeeping or something like that. And their real concern is that they just want to make sure that, people aren't experiencing harms. One difference between the lavender panic and the anti-trans panic is, people will argue, if you come out as gay when you're a teenager and you are gay for a while and then realize you're straight, there's no irreversible medical treatments that go along with that. Whereas, and this is why there's a big debate happening right now about the use of the word irreversible with puberty blockers, is that, like, there is a reality, and there's a different ethical cost-benefit analysis to be made when it involves medical treatments in this way. And that's why we don't have good enough data about how many people are detransitioning or, desisting, or there's different debates about the terminology, all these kinds of things. And even if, I think Callie and I probably both believe that, like, new data is mostly going to affirm that the vast majority of people are positively benefited from the treatment, and that, much like any medical treatment, there are some people for whom this is not the ideal treatment, and there may be some trade-offs involved there. But I definitely think that, it's reasonable to talk about, gatekeeping and people not profiting off of the suffering of others. And then there's this whole unreasonable world that essentially is going to say, I think people like Matt Walsh really have to get to a point where they enforce rigid heteronormativity. Because if you're going to say, no men, no biological men in women's restrooms, right? You're going to have to harass anybody who doesn't fit what is the accepted standard norm of what looks like a woman. And people like Kathleen Stock have acknowledged that means that, non-conforming lesbians are going to get harassed for using restrooms, stuff like that. So I don't see how their approach can get what they want socially in terms of protections for women's spaces and things like that without rolling back way more than just puberty blockers for prepubescent individuals.
Something that makes this so much more complicated is that, like Aaron said, I agree with what Aaron said about, like, where the average person is probably coming from in this conversation. And there is what the average person thinks, and then there are what the people who actually have the power to enforce those things think, right? Like the people, for example, in US government, right? I don't actually think that most of those folks have that kind of genuine concern, right? People like Matt Walsh, for example, he's obviously not a government person, but he's someone who has a lot of social power, right? I think with a lot of things, it's a calculated way to use their platform to push whatever they want to get from
political
the culture
and moral
war to try to create
agenda.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what I think makes it so hard, is because I do think the average person probably does have that sort of genuine understandable concern. But the people who are actually passing these laws and affecting this change, I don't think really do. And that it adds an extra layer of complexity to trying to talk about these issues, because it's really easy, if you're not super, super specific, it's really easy to substitute one group for another in the discussion. And for me, what I'm usually talking about are the people who have power to actually change the way that I live my life. Like, you know, my down the street neighbor, like, QAnon conspiracy guy. Like, I don't like that he thinks that way, but he doesn't really have any power over me. And as long as he's not going to like come to my house and kill me, like, do whatever you want, man. I don't care.
Though to be fair, just today, the Patriot, one of the Patriot Squad groups was out in front of a drag queen story hour that got canceled. If you want to talk about like escalating violence against trans community because of the panic, there it is.
I'll just bookend that with saying that's what makes it hard, is because some people do end up usurping that kind of power that aren't necessarily lawmakers, but they take it upon themselves to threaten violence, or even like threatening with violence, like a two steps removed sort of like, well, if these people don't chill out, things are going to get bad. Like, that's not a direct threat, but it kind of is a threat. And like, those are the kind of, like, it's all of those things at once that we're all trying to navigate.
I appreciate you bringing up a lot of these examples. I've often found that we can be much easier to point to egregious errors among our out-group than within our own in-group. So just for the sake of nuance, are there instances where you think that some people within trans activists have gone too far in your eyes, Callie, in a similar way that you could criticize the people that you just criticized? I'll give you one example. I read this tweet that said, a note for parents: if your child tells you that they are transgender, you have two choices. One, have a trans child. Two, have a dead child. It really is that simple. For so many of us, the ability to live authentically is a matter of life and death. When you read that sort of thing, it's not statistically true, but it seems to be exaggerating something in order to make a political point or to get more power within that community so that they can get the things that they want. How do you interpret it?
I mean, it's a little hyperbolic, but it's only a little hyperbolic, I think. I don't know what the utility would be of like parsing out that and dissecting that, because I think hyperbole, especially on Twitter, is a thing that is kind of accepted. But also, you know, sure, it's not statistically true. Okay. I'm not sure that really matters so much, because what they are pointing to is a very, very real phenomenon in which, you know, there is a very, very high percentage, comparatively high percentage of trans folks who either who die by suicide or try to. And then removed from that is the lifelong psychological and emotional trauma that can come from having family that don't affirm you. And I don't have the numbers in front of me, but you know, if you look at the mental health issues that as a whole the trans community deal with, like, everything is compounded by having parents who don't affirm who you are. And that's not the same as saying your parents can't like ask you questions or have conversations with you. But if a parent is just going to fundamentally deny who this kid is, I don't actually think that tweet is hyperbolic in a way that makes me feel uncomfortable. Like, I think it's obviously an exaggeration. I think basically anyone could see that, but I don't think it's an egregious one.
Well, yeah, I mean, because I do the moral panic stuff, I often get people coming at me like, well, aren't there moral panics on the left? Is this a moral panic on the left or that? I would say that sometimes the language around what we could call like trans genocide rhetoric does stray sometimes into that moral panic space in a similar way that I think some of the conversation around police shootings can stray into that space and get farther away from, I think, the statistical reality than is actually helpful. But I think what Callie's pointing to is the difficulty of assessing how much is that a real, like, genuine moral panic when you're dealing with a marginalized community that is experiencing serious mistreatment, right? If you know, for me, the concern about the overemphasis on police shootings is that it underemphasizes like the real statistical evidence of, you know, significant mistreatment at different levels of, physical violence that isn't just shootings. And similarly with the trans stuff, the focus on suicide, which, look, there are higher rates of suicide. So it's not, again, there is a truth to this idea. But I think the focus on it is because it is particularly scary sounding, and we're just desperately trying to get people to accept their loved ones so that they can be in healthy relationships. Would it be better if we focused more on, people who are alienated from their family members, people who experience depression and anxiety and, all these sorts of other things? That would probably be, potentially helpful. But I also think it's understandable why people point to the extreme, but like sometimes common reality that people, get pushed towards hurting themselves because they don't see any other way out.
And I think the other thing to consider too is when you're quoting like things that people say, I think it's important to consider the power dynamics in play, right? Because a person on Twitter being sort of hyperbolic does not have the same social cultural impact as someone like Matt Walsh, who has millions of followers, who, like, we know that his voice is very influential. People are going to believe what he says, and that I think it's a lot easier to draw a line between something that he says and a material harm that ends up coming to people than someone tweeting something that's a little hyperbolic. Like, I think you would have a hard time drawing a line between that and a real world material harm that ends up coming to a person than you would someone who has a large platform, someone who has a lot of social cultural influence. I think there's a very clear difference in the power dynamics at play there.
I think what you were asking for were examples where we feel like people take extreme positions. And I would say I'm not as concerned about that tweet, but I can give you examples. So I think claims, empirical claims that there is no difference between men and women when it comes to sports, biological men and women, seems implausible to me. We can have a debate about what fairness requires for trans athletes, but that has to take into account some of these other kinds of factors, and being kind of denialist about that, I think, is not helpful to that discussion, even though I also think the sports stuff is ultimately a wedge issue. But other things are like, there was a person who argued for a little while that having genital preferences is anti-trans or is transphobic. I do not believe that is the case. I do not think that your genital preferences, that is not to say that you can't have an interesting conversation about the ways that our sexual preferences are shaped by transphobia and racism and all these other kind of factors. But in and of itself, I do not think that having preferences for certain genitalia amongst your sexual partners is itself transphobic. And then there was, let me see, one other one would be in the area of treatment. There are folks who believe that there should be no gatekeeping whatsoever for access to hormones or something like that. I lean towards thinking that it should be coupled with some amount of counseling. I think that arguing, and like that one I'm very sympathetic to, because going back to Callie's point, when you're concerned that your gatekeepers by and large have a relatively anti-trans position, it's reasonable to be against gatekeeping full stop. But I think the ideal world would be one where individuals get appropriate counseling and help in making these kinds of decisions, and that they work through it in a step-by-step process, in a way that like isn't onerous for them, right? Doesn't require them to, act as if they are X for a certain amount of years or something before they can get treatment.
What ends up being problematic, I think, is that it always seems like we have to, like, there's so much nuance in all of this, right? And in order to lay out the full reality of the situation, I mean, we're coming up on 45 minutes and we've barely scratched the surface.
I know.
Sorry. But it's so easy for people fighting against those things to ask gotcha questions that seem very reasonable from the outside. And that's the hill that we are continually forced to climb, is that, we have to become experts on biology, on endocrinology, on social and cultural issues of gender. Like, we have to become experts on all of those things to be able to argue passionately with nuance, like, just to get someone to the stage of like, hey, I should be able to go like get hormones after an hour-long doctor appointment the way that I might get treatment for the flu or something like that. Like there's a very strong imbalance in that conversation. And I think that's something really important to name too.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. I appreciate when there are nuanced discussion. I'm not really here to take much of a stance on most of this because I want to focus on your perspectives and your point of views, but I will take one stance. And I think that that tweet I just read, I do see that as a moral panic of the same magnitude as moral panics you see on the other side. And you can think of it from a perspective of a parent who, let's say that their 5-year-old says they're transgender, and the parent says, what do I do about this situation? What are my options? I am an advocate of gender-affirming care in the sense of having a team of psychologists, doctors, and parents who are all working together to help understand and help the child understand what's going on and what might be best for that child. But there's no one-size-fits-all approach. And to say to a parent that their only options are, have them be trans or you're going to have a dead child, that puts an awful lot of pressure on an awful lot of people.
I mean, I'm sympathetic to your concern here. No, I mean, I do think that, I understand why some advocates use that kind of rhetoric. If I was talking to a parent, that would certainly not be the way that I would approach the conversation at all. It's kind of emotional blackmail, and I don't think that's what we should be doing here. But I think, the more reasonable version of that is the same conversation that people had to have with their families about being gay, which is this is who I am. You can be loving and accepting, or you can fight it. Now, again, this goes back to the social contagion thing. If you're one of these parents who thinks that your child has been indoctrinated, then you're in a different situation. But I also think, I think the point of the tweet is essentially, if you want your child to be healthy and happy, be affirming of what they say they are, whether that means getting them a therapist or what. If your response is that's not real, gender isn't real, you're a boy, shut up, yeah, you're probably going to increase their risk of various psychological harms, right? That's just a fact.
I don't know that's a fact.
A big problem that I see in the conversation often is that's obviously the way the person words things in that tweet is not how I would approach the conversation either by any stretch of the imagination. And if somebody was saying that to me, in a person to person thing, I'd be like, well, let's take a step back for a second. But I also worry that saying all of that, I'm not sure what is served by focusing so much on a tweet like that, when I don't know that it, in the grand scheme of things, really matters.
Well, it's an idea that I see propagated among a lot of trans activists. There is another option, though. So this, they present just two options: either affirm that they're trans or expect a dead child. But there is another option, which is an option a lot of the so-called TERFs are fighting for, and I wanted to get your thoughts on that option, which is saying, look, what's wrong with saying and teaching your child you are a boy, but you may have feminine interests, and there's nothing wrong with that whatsoever. You should go your whole life, being, fighting for the right to be non-typical of your of gender stereotypes and fighting gender stereotypes. So how would you react to someone who says, well, that could be a valid option?
My first response is to wonder if that person actually believes that, right? Because those are the same people saying that, I know who belongs in what bathroom by looking at them. So when that kid grows up and says, yes, I'm a boy, but I like to wear dresses, but I go into the boys' bathroom, I'm wearing a dress, how is that person going to react in real life? And that's always my first question, is when people say something like that. In all reality, that is the world that I would love to end up in, where people grow up free of pressure regarding gender roles of any kind. But I also don't believe that those folks genuinely think that writ large, because their behavior towards trans people, I don't think demonstrates that they actually think that.
And let me just add, to me, it's indistinguishable from saying, oh, well, no, Timmy's not gay. He's just, different. He just likes theater and, dance and stuff like that or something, right? Maybe, but if he's actually gay, then he's gay, and you shouldn't try to say, being gay is wrong and God hates it and you should try to be straight. And I think the difference is these people believe that there is such a thing as homosexuality, but they don't believe there's such a thing as transgender, because I don't think believe there's such a thing as gender, which I think is just implausible, because we live in a world constructed around gender, like not around biological sex, very clearly around gender and gender presentation. We're not, checking biological sex at bathrooms. We're checking gender presentation. So I think it's silly to sort of take the position that there's no such thing as gender or no such thing as being transgender. So if that's the view they're taking, that's false. And if the view is there is this thing, but it's harmful and you should avoid doing it, I think that's also false, and there isn't sufficient evidence to support that either. And I think, to some extent, we allow parents to be abusive towards their children if they're religious enough about it. And I think that's unfortunate. But I think for anyone who genuinely cares about your child, telling them that they're just effeminate or they're just a lesbian or something like that to help try to dissuade them away from this thing that you think is bad is probably not helping them. I think that's probably projecting onto them parts of your own insecurities that aren't healthy.
And I think there is a conversation pursuant to that is valid to have. And to say, if a kid comes to you and says, hey, I think I'm actually X, Y, or Z, to say, okay, what is it that makes you feel that way? Talk to me in depth and specifically about your feelings. What are the things that make you feel that way? And you might dig in and find that that's actually what the kid means, right? Because regardless of what we learn at home, we also get a lot of ideas from the culture that we grow up in, especially when we start going to school, when we start watching a lot of TV, all of that sort of stuff. So you may find that someone's like, oh, I think I'm a girl because I want to wear dresses, and that's what being a girl means to me in my 5, 6, 7-year-old view of what gender is. You may uncover that, and in that case, cool, whatever. But I think that's a very, very different thing than saying, no, actually you are this, and here's why you think what you think you do. I think it's entirely valid to dig further into why people feel the way that they do, but that's a very different thing from saying, no, you are this.
So what does it feel like to be a man who is a trans woman, who's a legit trans woman, to be a man identified as birth, I should say, who is a trans woman? What is that? What is, because that feeling is not standardized. It's not like you take everyone who is a man identified at birth and identifies as trans woman and say, what does that feel like? And it's objectively all exactly the same characteristics and mental things. So what's confusing to me is it seems like there's no standardization of that, and that's and so I'm trying to understand. It's all legit, right? You would never say there's an illegitimate trans woman, right? You would never say such a thing. I mean,
unless someone legitimately says, I call myself a trans woman because I think it's cool, or because my friends think it's for obviously disingenuous or dishonest reasons. But that's also just largely not a thing, like we talked about before.
Is it because there's a feeling of such a mismatch somehow? This is how I see it.
Sometimes.
Yeah.
I'll first give you the little bit of my personal experience, and then I'll kind of zoom out a little bit to what I understand talking to lots and lots of trans people over the course of however many years. For me, it was a very discrete sense that in 5th grade, 10, 11 years old, when you start to get the sort of basic sex ed conversations, your body is changing. Here are the ways you can expect it to change. It may have started already, etc. Those sorts of very basic puberty conversations. And I started to realize that I was uncomfortable during puberty in ways that a lot of people were not. And at first it was just okay, well, not everybody talks about these things. Maybe that's just, people are talking about those things because that's what the teacher told us about. And so now we're comfortable because we know that's a common thing, right? Puberty is weird because puberty is weird for basically everyone. And, over the course of however many years, I just kept having feelings that pointed me back in that direction. And sometimes, I would say most of the time for me, it was that sort of visceral discomfort that we generally call gender dysphoria, about not only my body, but also the way that I interact with the world, the way that other people interact with me. And sometimes it was more euphoria that it's like I get a lot of, and not just running away from the bad feelings, but chasing the good feelings in a way that says that our, like, the construction of gender that I was handed is not the one for me and doesn't make sense to me. And embracing that is what led me to come out and take all of the steps that I've taken. And I think there is, you ask 100 different trans people, you're going to get 100 different answers of, what they feel like that says to them, I am trans. And I think that is what often makes the conversation difficult, is because it is very subjective. There is no one size fits all. There is no standard. And I think the journey, I think, has to be just coming to comfort with that and understanding that that's like, the actual reality of it is that there are so many different paths to get there. And sometimes it is that visceral discomfort, that dysphoria. For a lot of people, it's understand, like I don't hate myself. I'm not uncomfortable. It's not, I'm not suffering, but my life gets so much better over here if I do these other things, if people treat me this way, if I do these sorts of things. And that's, a lesser part of my experience, but I know lots of trans people who, like, that's actually how they figured it out, is they were more chasing euphoria than running away from dysphoria, which was mostly what my experience was.
Thank you for telling me about your experience a little bit. And let me just follow up with this, Aaron. And I really want to hear even more experiences. So people listening to this podcast, please reach out to me. I want to know what it feels like, because I obviously am not a trans folk, but I want to know what it feels like to be I want to know, like, what that's like. And I really value and the dignity of that. But from a child development perspective, it's interesting to me because I see, I think about 5-year-olds, 6-year-olds. Let's say they go to their mom or they go to their friends. They say, let's say it's a boy, and the boy says, I am a girl because I like wearing dresses. That's all they say. Do you immediately legitimize that? You could see a sense. You can see the argument from certain what are they called, TERFs, saying, well, feminists have been fighting for so many years against such gender stereotypes. You can see that perspective in certain cases. So I'm just wondering what your thought is about that.
I mean, that's just the entry to a conversation like any other, I think. If you're trying to explain to a kid, like, the way that society looks at things and the ways that doesn't match with my values, and sometimes even the ways that, like, that doesn't match with reality. I mean, I think that's just the opening to a bigger conversation about what gender looks like in society. Because if someone said specifically, I think I'm a girl because I like wearing dresses, I would be like, well, wearing dresses does not necessarily make you a girl. Is that the only reason? Like, it's just an opening to talk more in depth about why they feel the way they do.
I don't want to start going down the rabbit hole. Then what is a woman? I don't want to do that. But I find myself in the way that I think scientifically wanting to know where the lines are in some way, like, if it's not, okay, then what is it? Like, Aaron, go on.
Well, let me help you, Scott. You're a scientist. I'm a philosopher. This is my job, right? Like, let's have a conversation about philosophy of gender for a second, and identity more broadly. Because I think, there is a concern that, well, if gender identity is subjective fundamentally, then we can't legislate it properly, or we can't, have social norms around it, or, like, what even is it? And I understand that concern. It would be much nicer if we had a chart and we could just quantify all of this stuff and it was very easy and functional. I don't think it's ever going to work that way. But I also want to highlight it doesn't work that way for any gender identities, right? Like, what is it, you could ask the same question. What does it feel like to be black? What does it feel like to be gay? What does it feel like to be half Jewish, right? Like, I don't do any Jewish things. I have a Jewish cultural background. It's complicated, right? So all identities are, to use the technical term here, empty signifiers, right? We have this concept and we have various things that for us, we connect to that concept. So Callie could potentially tell you things about what they associate with different kinds of gender or something like that. And those things are a mix of our own personal feelings, desires, intuitions, a mix of the way culture shapes our understanding around gender. And it could certainly be the case that if you were living in, like, a really heavily patriarchal society, which to some extent we are, some amount of individuals could internalize that patriarchy and think that that means that they should be men or something like that. That is, I think, part of the complexities of human psychology, but I don't think you can solve this either by pretending that gender is fundamentally objective and quantifying it in some way, or by throwing it out because it's too subjective. We need it in society. We have to have identities in these kinds of ways. We have laws about race. We have laws about sexuality, even though, like, if I claim that I'm gay or something like that, it's not like I can prove it to anybody. There's no set of behaviors that I could engage in that would make it absolutely 100% true that I'm really definitely gay. So I don't think there's a unique problem here for gender. I think it's okay that gender is fundamentally subjective in this kind of way.
Can you explain to me then why, explain to me the fundamental difference between that and why we don't allow racial identity changes. So a woman tried Rachel something, and black women in particular got very, very upset at that. There's like, you can't just, you go through a whole life of oppression and kind of what it is to face us. And in a way, they were like the TERFs of the transgender movement. In a way, analogous. TERFs are demonized, whereas black women in that case are exalted, and we all kind of agree with them with their point. And so can you explain the difference to me between racial identity and gender identity?
Well, I think fundamentally there's no difference, is what I'm going to say, right? Like, fundamentally, gender and race are the same in this kind of way that if you identify as one of these things, you, I think, fundamentally are that thing, right? So, for example, I know people who are very, very light-skinned, who identify as black, who are, accused of, like, not being actually black, even though they come from a black background or a black culture or something like that. So there's always going to be this kind of gatekeeping around these identities. Now, you could make an argument, potentially, that in our current situation, what someone like Dolezal, let's assume for the sake of argument that, like, Dolezal is 100% genuine. It's not a con to...
I get the sense she is genuine. Her whole life she has really identified more with African-American community than the white community, yeah.
I think if she really truly is genuine, she should be allowed to identify as black. I think there's ultimately no value in forcing her not to. Certainly people can say, I'm not going to, I'm going to have difficulty respecting that or something like that. But I think there is fun. I think here's what I would say. Our goal should be a society where there are no imbalances of power or marginalization such that an individual who wants to change their gender or sex or race or whatever can do so, and it doesn't matter. Like, it just doesn't matter. They just get to play with a new identity. I'm very sort of identity anarchist in that kind of way. In our current reality, it's more complicated, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't agree with that, but I respect your opinion, right? Isn't there something to be said that there's a great privilege there to be able to just say you are something, and there's someone who may have gone through 25 years of like constant sort of systemic oppression due to certain immutable characteristics they were born with. Certainly, you can see it from the other perspective as well, right?
Well, I think this is where I come in with, like, I get the philosophy side of things, but the way that my brain works is so much more about, like, how do these things actually end up playing out in real life? Because I think what's important to name is the sort of gatekeeping around certain kinds of identities and why that gatekeeping exists. Because most of the time, it's about a perceived security in that in-group. Right? Like, if I'm in a room with a bunch of other trans people, there is a level at which my transness statistically is safer in that space than it might be if I was in a room where I was the only trans person, right? And that doesn't mean that everyone around me is a great person, but just like, on balance, I can be a little bit more comfortable in my transness if I'm in a room full of other trans people. And that's where that sense of gatekeeping around identity comes in. And I think, it's important to name in this conversation that, like, there isn't a black person here to speak from that perspective. And I don't think that we can meaningfully have that conversation without a person coming from that. What matters, I think, is there's a level of good faith that we have to take into account, and people who are trying to sort of, like, usurp power or gain the sort of, like, coolness like whatever perceived coolness they have from that. Like this is a big thing in like vocabulary that starts out on Black Twitter, for example, being more widely adopted. And, you know, at first it's this silly, unsophisticated internet language. And then when white people decide it's cool, then it's fine, but it's like we invented it, right? And I think there is a difference in the cultural context between race and gender that I'm very comfortable saying that difference exists such that they are different problems, but I also am not enough of an expert on racial identity to be able to have like a super nuanced conversation about that. And so I don't like, I think in a practical sense, they are meaningfully different enough such as to not really belong in the same discussion. Because that's just not really a thing you see in the trans community. Like I don't know that I've ever met a trans person who is like, you know, I transitioned because there's some perceived benefit to me, aside from comfort in my own body and my own life, right? Like I'm not gonna like, oh, I'm trans because that gives me some sort of social cred or some sort of social power that I didn't have before in a certain community. And I think in the cases where that happens, at least in my experience, you end up generally being able to suss that out pretty well just by like seeing how those folks behave and the way that they talk. And so I don't know that even like gatekeeping around that identity is even the way to do it, right? Like, because if I suspected that, like in a hypothetical world where I thought someone was like faking being trans to get some perceived cultural benefit because they wanted to like run this nonprofit and get whatever power comes from that, right? Like there's not really any benefit to me like questioning that person's trans identity, where I can just be like, well, like you're saying and doing these things that tell me you haven't done the work. You don't actually understand the cultural context that all of this is happening in. And so you're not qualified for this. And I don't like have to litigate whether they're a real trans person or not. Right. Like I think they are meaningfully separate discussions for like all of those reasons.
Well, the sports world is relevant to this though, because a lot of people do accuse trans women of trying to game the system in some way, and that may be a moral panic, right? That may be incorrect. It could also be correct. You two, tell me what is correct. Tell me what is correct.
I can speak to this because I play a contact sport. I play roller derby.
Sport of gender nonconforming individuals, from what I can tell.
In my wildest hypothetical world, I guess I could maybe see that happening, but the idea that someone would transition and take hormones and go through all of the other bullshit that trans people have to go through in life to pursue like living your life as a trans person, that someone would pursue that to like get to the top of, like, that's just a really, really silly idea to me. And also, and maybe this might be shaped by the sport that I play, because there are things about roller derby that say that like being physically stronger and bigger does not necessarily give you an advantage because of specific dynamics about roller derby. But like, and I know this is anecdotal, but I just think of like all of the times physically smaller, not necessarily stronger cis women have absolutely rocked the shit out of me. I just think about
center of gravity than you.
Like, yeah, like in theory, I should be able to show up and just clean house, right? If I had some sort of inborn advantage that was so big that I don't even belong in that space, right? Like, I would imagine that I should be able to show up there and clean house. And like, that's just not what you see happening time and time again across all of the different sports that trans folks are allowed to play in, right? Like, it's just not a thing you see. Trans folks don't generally dominate those sports that we're allowed to participate in.
And the one case that it does happen is the one that generates so much attention. Yeah, that's an interesting point.
I do think there are, like, reasonable versions of a lot of the concerns that you're raising here, Scott. So I've listed a couple of them. It could be the case, for example, that and we're almost always only talking about trans women in women's sports because for the most part, nobody thinks that like trans men have any kind of substantial advantage.
Right.
It could be the case that like nobody is actively trying to cheat, but they're still creating an unintentionally unfair situation. And that's an empirical question and an ethical question that you have to parse as a society. What are the range of, acceptable differences that we want people to compete with? Like, do we switch to, weight classes or something like that? Like, there are different debates to be had there on an applied level that I think are perfectly reasonable to have, especially once you've accepted that like trans people are what they are, and we're going to let them live their lives while we also talk about the details of sports. Other things that I think you've brought up that are genuine concerns, aping identity stereotypes, right? If this is really like someone who pretends to be, a different race or something by adopting a bunch of stereotypes about them, then that would be a significant problem. That's been a longstanding accusation against drag culture even before everybody got really concerned about trans culture. And I think, it's complex because part of your identity is going to be tied to social expectations. And sometimes you're going to invert them and sometimes you're going to adopt them. Two other things would be threats to people in safe spaces. So it's not just, we don't want them to be in there because we don't think they're women, but also like we're concerned that somebody might, if it's subjective, they'll claim to be this so that they can get into a rape crisis center or something like that. Again, these are vanishingly small. When something like this does happen, it's incredibly rare and wouldn't be solved except by a really, really draconian alternative, where the solution is just, I think, provide proper care. And then finally, the stealing valor or advantage stuff, right? Which are slightly different, right? There's one thing is future benefits. One thing is taking credit for being a member of a marginalized community, right? And I think, there can be some concerns there, but I also think it ultimately, at the end of the day, trying to police people out of these communities because you see marginalization status as a limited resource that can't be spread around in this kind of way more. I just don't think understands the problem. But like, I understand why people have these unfairness reactions, and it's worth coming to them and addressing them honestly, because not everyone's using them as a wedge issue, even if Matt Walsh is.
My question with those things always ends up being, if these are genuine fairness concerns, why do they only come up, or at least mostly only come up, when trans people enter the conversation, right? The classic example that folks point to is Michael Phelps. I think it is objectively true that he has a biological advantage over other people in his sport, because, and specifically because his body naturally produces less of the chemical that makes your muscles sore when you exert them, right? I forget the name of it, but, I don't remember any large conversation about whether or not it was fair for him to participate in that sport because he had that biological chemical advantage over other people. And, every sort of perceived advantage that someone might have in a sport that involves physicality, like I can point to cis women who have those same characteristics, but there's not really been a large conversation around gatekeeping those folks out of participation. And what it comes back to at the core is that people don't believe that trans identity is real. They don't think trans people exist, that we're faking it somehow to gain some advantage. And, in some hypothetical world where being trans becomes no big deal and like there's not really any great hardship in life associated with being trans, I guess in theory I could see someone like, yeah, let me go do this so I can win at sports. But I just think I think those concerns are plausible in some hypothetical world that we are so far away from, such that I'm not even sure that it's a conversation that's worth spending a ton of time on, if that makes sense.
Well, that's interesting. So do you think there's no debate to be had about whether at the most elite level of sports we should let in trans folk? Do you think there's no debate to be had there at all?
No, I don't think there is. I think if we want to talk about what constitutes fairness in sport in a way that doesn't single out trans people, sure, maybe. But that's just that's not the conversation that's being had, because I don't remember any of this being a concern until there started being conversation about trans people in sports, right?
Well, let me just add another example, right? You mentioned Michael Phelps. I remember when Michael Phelps was competing, there was like a very brief discussion about the fact that because he was an American, he got to use a one-off swimsuit that like makes, gives you a slight advantage that costs $20,000 million or some like ridiculous amount of money for a swimsuit. And that's perfectly legal within the sport, even though everyone acknowledges that it gives some amount of advantage and that not every, person coming to that competition has the same resources at their disposal for training and all these other kinds of things. Like the idea that sports is remotely fair is absurd. It's clearly driven by income and a variety of other factors. If you want to start, like, I think Callie's right. If you want to have a conversation about genuine fairness in sports, have a conversation about all of it and not just this one tiny issue, which, look, if you said we're going to allow trans women in women's sports at every level as openly as we can, you would see a tiny number of individuals competing and they would have not a significant impact. But there's also a stupid catch-22 here, which is trans women in sports end up having, being in this place where if they win, then they cheated. And if they lose, then they were throwing the game in order to show that, it's not actually a problem, so we can sneak more trans women into sports. There's literally no way for a trans woman to compete in sports without being accused of doing something wrong. So I think that's clearly a problem.
Unless they, quote, stay in their lane, and that's a horrible phrase. But, they could make...
But they're not allowed to. There's a trans individual who wrestles. There's a trans individual, a trans man, and that's why you don't know about it, who wants to wrestle against men down in Texas and wasn't allowed to. The law prevented him. He had to wrestle against women. And then, of course, the anti-trans people took pictures of that and said, look, this is what the trans advocates want because he looks mannish and he's wrestling a woman, right? When in reality, it's the exact opposite. It's their rules that are preventing individuals from doing this, but because it's a trans man, nobody cares.
And I also think there is a somewhat unspoken misogyny in the debate. Like I specifically remember talking to a roller derby teammate of mine that I was getting to know, and she is someone who is just physically small in almost every way, but just an unbelievable skater, super, super talented skater. And she was telling me how upset she gets over it because it's a lot of ways people telling her that she is weak and needs to be defended from people like me. And it just completely moves past all of the training and the work that it takes to get good at a sport. Right. And so I end up in this place where I spend, 2, 3, 4 years working really, really hard to get good at my sport, to learn how the game is played on a strategic level, to build up my physical endurance and my physical strength to get good at that. And then when I'm good at that, I end up being put in a position where to look reasonable, I have to argue for my own mediocrity. Right? I have to justify my presence by saying no, I'm actually not that good at this. Despite the fact that I spent the reason I'm good at this is because I worked really, really hard to get there. And I also have, I had the financial advantage that I, had time to go to practice, and there are maybe things about my physical makeup that make me more predisposed to athleticism than the average person. But the conversation, the conversation never turns to that. And people don't want to hear about how much muscle mass I lost when I started estrogen, those sorts of things. If we are really truly to have a conversation about fairness in sports, the focus on trans people makes zero sense. The idea that these conversations writ large didn't really happen until trans people entered the picture, I think is very telling of what the actual motivation is.
First of all, I'm sorry to hear about your experience there. I can imagine that would be incredibly frustrating. So I can 100% transport my mind into your mind and see what that would be like for all your hard work to be discounted. That would suck.
It's not great.
Yeah, that absolutely suck. Do I think there is no debate to have? I'm not there. I'm not there with you. That we should just stop that discussion.
I don't think so. I don't think Callie's saying we should stop the discussion. I think Callie's pointing out that the hyper emphasis on one tiny piece of the fairness discussion, I think, is a legitimate concern. That you are focusing on a tiny, tiny issue and saying that your real concern is fairness, broadly speaking, in sports. And that gives the impression that, like, if not for the existence of trans women in sports, it would be a perfectly fair meritocracy, which it's just not. Now you can say, well, we don't want to add any more unfairness in than we absolutely have to. In which case, I agree. We should have as little unfairness as we possibly can while respecting everybody's right to engage in sports. And if you want to tell me what your approach is for letting, trans women, engage in sports in a way that seems fair, I'm happy to hear like a variety of options. But if the answer is going to be they can't transition or they have to, be men or something like that, then I think you're creating an unfair, an inequitable system in that direction. And I don't think there's any substantial benefit to that, right? I think it's worth, educating people about the complexities of sports fairness. So the conversation is worth having, but I also think it's worth acknowledging on a meta level. It does seem like there is a hyper emphasis on a particular group who is also, again, this is how you tell if something's a wedge issue, that like this is a group that is being attacked across the board right now in a way that suggests that the emphasis on sports is just an acknowledgement that people care about sports and it's an easy target to start people on the path to not believing in trans people.
I totally hear you, but I also think this stuff is and I know you think this stuff is complicated too, so you're not going to disagree with me when I say this stuff is complicated, but some people could argue like, okay, but they are rightly attacked. You could see someone being on the show right now and taking another perspective and saying, well, 30, 40 years ago, a man trying to sneak on the woman's team would be attacked, and rightly so. And it's because the way they're thinking about the issue is they're not 100% with you that trans women are women. We kind of jumped to the deep end. We didn't even get through some basics, like, is sex a binary? I had questions here in my thing, like, just like basic things to see, like, are we all in agreement on certain things? And so that's why this stuff gets so tricky, because people are coming at this from just fundamentally conceptualizing a human in a different way.
Well, yeah, and again, for me, it comes back to the focus, like Aaron was saying, because, I look at like all of the people talking about fairness in women's sports. My next question is, who's your favorite women's sports team? Like,
right.
Why is it that your concern for women's sports only started to exist when trans people entered the conversation? Like, I have to be suspicious of someone's motivations if that's the truth, right? And so at that point, like, we're not having a fairness in sports conversation. We're having a transphobia conversation. And and that's not to say, to the earlier conversation, that's not me accusing everyone of entering the conversation of being consciously disingenuous. I don't think that's the case at all. I think people really do, in good faith, have that concern. But I think those folks have been, I guess, like, pushed in one direction or another without the full picture. I think people with bad faith are taking advantage of people with good faith, if that makes sense.
Oh,
That's
wow.
how moral panics work a lot of the time. And Scott, I think actually that this has been really valuable. Like, I know you feel like we haven't gotten to some of the basics. I don't think we need to have a chat here. I mean, like, biologists can have a chat about the binary nature of sex. I don't think it's actually crucially part of our conversation here. I think we would probably agree that, like, the vast majority of individuals cluster to, to particular poles, but does binary mean literally everybody? Or, how do you take about, the other percentage of intersex individuals, et cetera? But it's not important. Like, that's not our concern here. I think our concern here is,
I think it's a little important.
well, what I'll say is here, I think what matters is downstream questions about, is it harmful to women in sports if trans women are allowed into their sports? Is it physically dangerous to them, or is it unfair to them? Right. And the question of whether or not sex is a binary doesn't address that. Right. What addresses that is conversations about different capacities, about the effects of testosterone on puberty, about the limits of what we will consider acceptable or unacceptable advantages within sports. So like it's better for us to be having these more deep end, I think, conversations, because I think those, like, is sex a binary? How do you define women? Those are often not intentionally, but sometimes intentionally used as these kind of thought-terminating cliches where the goal is to get hung up on biology or metaphysics when the real question should be, who's allowed to use which bathrooms without being harassed? And the answer should be everybody, right? Like, you should be allowed to use the bathroom you identify with, and we're not going to police you on this. Look, if you do something criminal, then we will, deal with that. But I got to be honest with you. If I want to harass women, I don't have to dress up as a woman and go into a women's bathroom to do it. Like, that's like in sports. Like, it's way too much effort in order to try to do the thing that society already lets me do.
Yeah. This is in a way like the Benjamin Button of interviews, because I kind of want to end with a discussion of the difference between sex and gender. We should have started with that shit. Maybe you have an opinion. Both of you seem to have an opinion. Maybe that's irrelevant to all these conversations. I think it's really important for these conversations.
It's not irrelevant. Just not. I think a starting place of Callie's experiences is a better starting place than a philosophical debate about sex and gender.
Then I'm happy I started with that then.
Yeah, I think that was absolutely the right choice.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah.
Okay, good. You know what? Then I'm happy that we did that.
Yeah. I would also say I don't think it's irrelevant, but I think it's something that requires a lot less attention than it's often given.
That's interesting because I feel like there are different within the trans community. There's different conceptualizations of the isomorphism, sorry to get really nerdy there, between sex and gender. So some are make it very clear that trans is having a gender identity that is really at odds, doesn't match your sex, and they can separate the two things. Some I start to see these things get conflated in a way where I say, okay, transgender women, are transgender female? Like male female tends to be sex labels, and men tend to be identities. I think there's disagreement there within the trans community exactly, what that is. Some I would talk to be like, no, we acknowledge that, trans women are women, but we still acknowledge that we're biologically male, and where others may say, no, they're the same thing. So I didn't even ask what do you think about that, Callie?
The reason that I am uncomfortable with questions like that is because the way that those questions are often presented ends up being presented in such a way as to diminish trans identity in one way or another, right? Like, oh yeah, you're a woman, but you're really a male, right? And I know this is just anecdotal, but I don't think I have personally ever been asked that question in a way that I felt wasn't in pursuit of that. Because my question is, in the broader societal sense, in terms of how we treat people, what rights we give access to people, or what rights we give people access to, I don't think that matters. If we're trying to answer, a question about the scientific reality of what human beings are in one sense or another, what, chromosomes look like, what sort of hormones people have and that kind of stuff. Sure. I mean, I want to have as much information about biology and all of that sort of stuff as I can, but I don't think that is the conversation that we're actually ever having, really. And I think there is a complex relationship between those things, because I think gender is very socially constructed. I think it is socially constructed around at least superficial realities about the way biology ends up playing out, what is most of the time. But I also think it's worth pointing out that there are roughly the same number of intersex people as there are redheads in the human population, right?
Well, that statistic is not true, actually.
I'd be interested in your sourcing, because everything okay. But that is to say that even if we were to acknowledge that things are mostly binary, they're not as much as we really think they are. But then I also have to come back to, why does that matter for the purpose of the discussion?
It's the latter part there that I'm with you. Why does it matter from the perspective of the dignity and worth of a lived experience? I would be so on the same page with you there, right? But from the sense of, for getting biology right, that's in its own category is important.
I totally agree with everything Callie's saying there. As a from the philosophy side, I will always be willing to jump in and talk about conceptual distinctions. But I will preface it by saying I think politics and the well-being of individuals should be the defining decision maker, not, definitions. Partly because, look, at the end of the day, there's no true definitions for words. I think this is a problem that some people get lost on, which is there's no correct definition of woman. There are more or less useful definitions of woman, right? And the same thing in biology, right? Like, let's talk about the definition of sex. Is the definition of sex purely related to chromosomes? Is it a mix of chromosomes and phenotypes? So like sometimes people will tell me that it's just chromosomes, and then I'll say, well, okay, then let the person do all the other sort of stuff. And they'll say, well, no, but that it's also phenotypes and stuff like that. So what I think is there is something that there is to be biologically male and biologically female. It has to do with chromosomes and testosterone. And there's a spectrum of, where what mix of those properties that you have. And it's important to know that. I think you're 100% right.
I would say bimodal, not a spectrum. But yeah.
I meant by spectrum, like some men have low testosterone, some men have high testosterone. And it's actually not the case that there's an easy correlation between those things and body strength, for example. It's more complicated than you'd think. That is not to say I do think that testosterone has an impact on things like muscle mass development, etc. But the point is, I was just trying to make, I think it's important to distinguish between sex and gender, because when a trans individual goes to a doctor, their doctor should understand their medical history, which includes that they were born a particular biological sex and transitioned at some point. That can impact the way that they need to be treated medically. Absolutely, right? And then gender. So we have gender and gender identity, right? So gender is sort of the outside in approach where society constructs your gender through gender norms and things like that. And then gender identity is the subjective, how you experience your own gender from the inside out. And all three of these things are interconnected in every individual to some extent. But they are separate things, and we have to treat them separately. Because again, right, you're not checking chromosomes at the bathroom door. You're checking, do they look like XYZ or not? Right? You're checking gender and gender identity, because they're real. And that's what makes them real. Like, they're social constructs, but they're social constructs that consistently impact a person's life. If you don't fit your gender norms, you have a different experience in life than if you do in a gender normative society like ours. So it's clearly real.
And what becomes interesting there is, like, there are some ways that I actually think the medical profession would do well to pay more attention to those kinds of things, because we often talk about how, making medication decisions, for example, right? Like what your hormonal makeup is affects the way that you react to certain medications, for example, right? So like that's one reason why it would be at least somewhat important for a doctor to know, like, the circumstances of your birth, if you're on hormonal treatment of some kind, even outside trans folks. Like, if you were born with a hormonal imbalance, where you have a certain number of chromosomes, but your body reacts to hormones differently, which is like what a lot of intersex conditions are. But also, like, a lot of doctors just assume a lot of those things without ever checking them out, right? And so that's what ends up happening is, like, if the focus really is the well-being of trans folks, we would actually be having a different conversation. Because if we were talking about people's actual well-being, the conversation would be, no, actually a doctor should know all of this stuff about you from the jump because it affects the way that your body might absorb certain medications. But the medical profession as a whole likes to just assume certain things. Like, you've got M checked on the box, so I know that I can prescribe you X medication because people with M in this box react to this medication in this way, right? But that's, like, not really the conversation that ends up happening writ large, right? The conversation it looks entirely different because the basis of the conversation is not actually that.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I would and that and say that within the field of psychology, if the specific topic is how can we maximize the well-being of trans folk, I think that it's a very woefully understudied topic within psychology, and we actually don't have the answers that are definitive along those lines.
I would strongly disagree with that.
Talk to me. Why? You think all things point to a certain direction?
I think it's very, very clear that affirming someone's identity to the extent that they feel it necessary to hormones or surgeries or whatever. Like, I think it is very, very clear that access to those things is, and that's not to say that all trans folks want those things. A lot of trans folks don't, in fact. A lot of trans folks don't feel it necessary for their own well-being. I think it is very, very clear that people being affirmed in their identity to that extent is it's just very, very clear that that is the right answer.
Let me just jump in and preempt a potential concern. I know some folks will be thinking, what's your scientific evidence for that? And I do think we don't have enough really, really good
longitudinal data.
Yeah, about any of this, because it's very hard to study. It's very hard to even sample. So a lot of the studies about trans individuals are bad because they sample specifically, detransitioners in radical anti-trans communities, or they sample specifically, pro-trans individuals who are part of a Trevor Project activity. You're not getting an unbiased sample is what I'm saying. A lot of folks will cite Jack Turbin's studies that they show that the vast majority of gender affirming care works out well for people, and his studies have selection problems as well. So I think we should, we need more data, right? And the absolute
that's all I'm saying.
Well, I was just gonna say the best way to get that data is continuing to provide this kind of care while also studying the impacts, while also destigmatizing it, because I do think we have enough evidence to suggest that this is a treatment that helps a significant portion of individuals, and they should have access to it. And the question is, how big is that portion of individuals? How do we assess which of those individuals get this treatment? And how do we minimize individuals who get this treatment when it wouldn't be the ideal treatment for them? Look, sometimes, think about people who deal with antidepressants, right? How many different types of antidepressants they go through, some of which have really, potentially significant side effects before they find the right treatment. Sometimes people are going to, try transitioning to some extent, and it's not going to help with their issues, and they're going to try something else. I don't think we should see those people as being victims of medical malpractice. I think that's a very different story from somebody who just gets shoved into hormone treatment or something because ideologically the doctor thinks that this person is trans and they should be pushed that way.
And I think it's really important to interrogate the reasons why, too, because a lot of people end up pursuing transition-related things, whether it be hormone surgery, anything like that, and they desist not because it was the wrong thing, but because they can't handle what it is to live in society as a trans person. I'm thinking specifically of there was I think a sports broadcaster who ended up dying by suicide, not because being trans was the wrong thing, but because she was just entirely unprepared to live that life, experiencing personal and systemic misogyny, right? And so I think it's really important to ask those kinds of questions too. We have to dig a little bit deeper, anyone I know who has regrets around surgery, for example, it's not because they thought the surgery was wrong. It was because the surgeon did a bad job, or, some other reason like that, not because the thing itself was the wrong decision.
Within psychology, maybe I'm wrong, but I have this principle that there's no one-size-fits-all approach. And there is such pressure from a lot of people, psychologists, to be trained to immediately affirm every patient who comes to them who says that they potentially might be the opposite gender, or they might be that is a mismatch to what they're identifying as birth. And it's almost like taboo for a psychologist to be able to just say, okay, well, let's explore this. Let's see what might be right for you, in the sense of maybe trans. There's kind of an encouragement to affirm them as trans, as opposed to figure out other psychological ways for them to deal with it. Yeah.
This seems in conflict with the stories that I hear from trans individuals.
I was going to say that is counter to so much of what I hear. Yeah. And again, it's because all three of us are probably bringing our anecdotal experiences to it. Right. And so it's obvious that our experiences would be a little different, but this isn't to say that my anecdotal experience is worth more than other folks. But I will just say I know a lot of trans people, and universally the problem is finding a therapist who doesn't push back and fight against someone's trans identity. And then also someone who doesn't want to tie every single problem in a person's life to being trans. And this is actually an issue that I'm dealing with right now. Like, I want to have a therapist because I need coping skills for ADHD and anxiety and going through a divorce. Being trans actually is really not anything causing any problem in my life right now. I have to find a therapist who is like cool with me being trans, but also doesn't want to make every conversation about that, you know? Yeah. And it's, as far as I can tell in the trans community, the problem is actually that finding affirming therapists isn't even a problem. It's finding like trans competent therapists. Like, what does that even mean? Right. Like, I know so many people who have had to educate their mental health and medical providers about like what it even means to be trans, like let alone, you know, affirming them or like helping them through that journey. Because I mean, I think if someone comes to a therapist and says like, I think I'm trans and this is, you know, the source of some conflict or problem for me, like I think it would be a bad therapist that didn't dig into that, right? But I think there's a very big difference from saying like, let's talk more about this and let's like dig through those feelings and explore that. There are different ways to approach that, right? That don't cause harm.
If I can also share secondhand, somewhat vaguely, a story, because I know a lot of people are concerned about this specifically with regard to children, that children are being over-supported in this sort of thing, which hopefully will allay some people's concerns. So I know several individuals who transitioned at a variety of different ages, including an individual who transitioned pre-puberty. Now, what do I mean by that? This is an individual, and like I'll emphasize, this is an individual who lives in a place that is anti-trans. Her biological father is anti-trans. She has faced serious conflict over this for her entire life, but she's also persistently identified this way for her entire life, as far as anyone can tell. They tried to like pressure it out of her in all the kinds of ways that you could imagine. Didn't work, right? And so what she has experienced is, you know, first what Callie was describing, the kind of social transition, and then you don't start taking puberty blockers until puberty starts to set in, right? And the idea is at that point you make a medical decision. And what this individual experienced is not, you know, here's your drugs, off you go, right? It was a persistent process where they worked, you know, they met with counselors and medical professionals who were very candid about the potential, you know, I don't love the term harms, but let's, you know, like side effects of, hormone replacement things. You know, the reasons that I think it's probably best not to say that hormone replacements are irreversible. I think that's too strong a claim. What I think we can say is an individual of that age can be given sufficient information about things like potential sterility, potential impacts on bone density, etc., such that they can make an informed consent decision. I think that is very possible for someone even at that age. And you know, what that person experienced was what they call sort of careful waiting and watching or something like that, or you know, like they had to be persistent, insistent, and consistent in their demands to transition, right? So it, you know, that's how they kind of, I think, weed out this idea of this person is maybe being socially pushed in this direction, or maybe it's just experimenting or something with someone who, like, you know, this is really, really core to their identity in this kind of way, in an immutable kind of way. That, you know, they had conversations with their parents, with the doctors and everything, essentially ultimately decided to get the treatment. And I think that is good. Like, I think that's what we should want. When I share that story with gender critical people, they tend to call me a groomer.
Well, they're going to flip their lid. No,
yeah,
I was just going to say.
Do. Yeah.
Well, you just said they're going to flip their lid. Yeah.
But I think that's absolutely, like, that's how medical ethics works, in my opinion. Like, I teach medical ethics. Medical ethics is very messy.
Not many people can say that.
Yeah, and it is a complicated situation where often there are no perfect answers. There are only answers, again, with trade-offs and benefits. And I would argue that young people should have bodily autonomy and the ability to make medical decisions as long as they are given adequate information and are at an age where they can sufficiently understand that. And I think this person was at that age.
I will play devil's advocate here in a second. Callie, do you largely agree with Aaron's perspective there?
Entirely, yeah.
Okay.
And my thing
Not
is
just largely, entirely.
I think we can have a conversation about whether or not the current level of gatekeeping is a good one or not. But I think it's important to acknowledge the reality that in all cases that I'm aware of, like, the level of gatekeeping is extraordinarily high for kids to access anything medical, anything outside of, the previously discussed, like, different clothes, haircut, that sort of stuff, puberty blockers, hormones, surgery. I agree with Aaron that calling it irreversible is too much. But also I think it goes a little far in the other direction. Like, your first dose of estrogen, you have like irretrievably changed your life in huge ways. And my thing is, like, we don't even often start from the reality that this is often so difficult to access for people, right? Like, I'm not an expert in child development or medical ethics like Aaron. And so, like, I hesitate to offer a really strong opinion on, like, specifically what the level of correct gatekeeping is. But I do think it is important to start from the basic reality that right now the barriers to accessing that are huge. And there are medical professionals and mental health professionals involved at several stages along the way over a long period of time before anything like that happens. And we have to just start from that reality. Like, this is not a thing where, a 7-year-old walks into a doctor's office and walks out with puberty blockers. Like, that's just not a thing that happens.
Well, that's something that helps lower the temperature. To do that, to make that very clear, that it's like even within the trans community, it's considered a big deal when a 12-year-old, I guess 12-year-old, I went through puberty at 12, that where a 12-year-old takes a testosterone blocker, for instance. That's not like the most common outcome.
Yeah, the story I told you is the only story I know of an individual who, like, didn't start to deal with this stuff sort of mid or post puberty.
Right. Yeah, and I will say one of the premier trans kids programs in the country is in Cincinnati. It's at Cincinnati Children's Hospital. Like, people come from very far away to come to Cincinnati Children's for their trans program. And so, like, I've been to a lot of events where the folks who run that clinic talk about what the process looks like, and, like, it exhausts me just hearing about it, honestly. Like, the level of and I mean, these are, like, enthusiastically trans affirming care providers that still, like, there's lots of therapy, lots of medical evaluation, lots of consultations with parents and the kids, and all of, like, there's so much that happens before any like actual medical intervention happens.
And let me just add something. There's a burden issue here in our ethical trade-off debate, which is, any amount of gatekeeping is going to come at a cost to the individual who's trying to get medical care, because they, it's an onerous burden to get multiple appointments, all these kinds of things. It may be a necessary cost. But there is the additional cost of being in a for-profit system. We haven't even talked about the capitalist aspect. You wanted
to talk about that. I have a note that you wanted to talk about that 2 hours ago.
Right, and partly Matt, Matt Walsh a little while ago released an edited clip of someone talking about the costs of transitioning, claiming that like this is proof that this is all just a big for-profit money-making scheme for doctors or something like that.
And it's not. Is that what you're saying?
It's not. No, I don't believe it is. Look, I don't think that there should be profit in capital, or
no more than all of medicine is a scheme to make money.
I mean, interestingly, those arguments are functionally identical to anti-vaxxer arguments in the sense that they're just claiming that this is a profit-driven treatment instead of an actually beneficial treatment. But setting aside that conspiratorial side of things, individuals who want medical care in our society who don't have good health care have to pay a lot. I don't know if I can curse on the show because I'd say a whole lot.
You can.
Yeah,
I do,
fucking
and
lot,
I do.
right? Like a fucking ton of money, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
if you say you have to meet with this many doctors this many times to get this treatment, you are saying transitioning costs this. This is the baseline cost for you to be allowed to have access to your medical rights. So that's a problem. I think the problem for that is not get rid of gatekeeping, but is instead, get rid of for-profit medicine. But if you are in that particular reality, you could be much more sympathetic to the idea of black market hormones because people can't afford to go see a bunch of doctors, but they can afford to buy hormones on the internet.
Because importantly, the hormone treatments that trans folks get largely were hormone treatments that were invented for cis people who have hormone imbalances, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like,
yeah, that's right.
The regimen of hormones that I was initially put on, like my doctor told me, like this is like it's not identical, but functionally this is like the same treatment that postmenopausal cis women get, and even like phalloplasty operations that trans men get to surgically construct a penis, vaginoplasty, like all of those surgeries have roots in solving problems not for trans people, and they're just being applied in a different way. And so like this is definitely not an invented industry simply to make money, because like all of these things were not invented specifically for trans people. Like they're obviously applied in slightly different ways, but they certainly don't exist just for us.
Sure. No, that's true.
Right.
That's very true. Okay. Well, I did say I was going to push back a little bit, didn't I? The idea of whether or not a 12-year-old should ever be in a universe where they consent to that. Well, I guess the point there is, doesn't the parent have to consent as well? So what if the child wants to do it and the parents don't want it to happen? What happens in that case, out of curiosity?
I mean, so what if a 12-year-old's pregnant and wants to get an abortion and their parents are fundamentalists?
Right.
I don't think that the parent gets to decide that.
The parent doesn't get to
I don't
decide.
think that the law should be allowed to prevent the child from getting the abortion because the parents are against it. So I think we can all agree that there is at least one case where parental rights lose out to child autonomy.
Okay, someone could say that's a false analogy.
Well, I was going to say, the second part is this situation sufficiently like that situation?
Right.
And I would say the answer is yes. I would say there are some differences, but they are not morally relevant differences to me.
So I guess maybe my mind is more not made up than yours on this topic, because I had a very interesting conversation with Carol Hooven, who's a evolutionary biologist at Harvard, who will be part of this 4-part series upon which you two are featured as the first ones. Woohoo! I had a very interesting conversation with her because she studies the science of testosterone and the role that it plays in sexual dimorphism and its evolutionary origins,
She wrote
etc.
the book T or something?
She wrote the book T. That is correct.
It's a good book. I actually enjoyed that book. I recommend it to folks.
Cool. Excellent. And I asked her to walk through the science for me. She made it very clear that taking testosterone blockers right before puberty is irreversible in the sense she says it will make you sterile, and it also will make it so you will never be able to experience an orgasm your entire life. And those seem to be things that
that seems. Yeah, that second part is much more questionable than the first one.
I have questions about that.
You have questions. Okay.
Absolutely.
Well,
I have massive
please reach out to
questions
her
about
and email her after you hear my chat with her. Maybe I didn't 100% quote her properly.
It's a claim I've heard before. It's a claim I hear that people saying that like trans people can no longer experience sexual pleasure stuff like that.
If right before puberty they do one of these kind of medical, only in that case, right. But she made a case why that would be the case biologically, and I guess those are pretty big deals, and I would just really want that 12-year-old to they've never in their life probably have experienced an orgasm, so it's not like they can do the thought experiment and make that lifelong decision whether or not to go down one path or another. They won't ever be able to know what the alternative would be to make that decision. Yeah,
That's true in a lot of decisions,
see that,
unfortunately.
But yeah, I mean that's where I come back to understanding the just unreal level of torment that it is to be trans and to be denied the ability to do what you need to do to feel good about that, like that, because even like, let's just assume that is the case, right? That doesn't actually make it any more clear to me, right? Because that is certainly a cost for sure. Like it would be silly to not acknowledge that as a cost, but
Assuming
also assuming it's real. Yeah. But like that also doesn't erase the very real cost of someone being forced to go through a puberty that is torture, right? Like, and this is obviously I'm speaking from an adult perspective, having, I had bottom surgery 6 years ago. I was, 32, 33. So it's a very different thing. But there was a period of time in my recovery where I thought I had actually lost sexual function as a result of the surgery that I had. Okay. And for me, that would have been a very high cost, to be sure. But I still would have preferred that outcome to not having had it. Like, it was that big of a deal for me. And so I don't want to dismiss that concern at all, but that still doesn't make it like a black and white easy choice, I don't think.
I mean, so I'm not a biologist. From what I understand, the sterility issue is more sort of substantiated. Yes. The no orgasm thing I would push back on in various ways, such as like, how are you defining an orgasm and measuring it? Like, lots of problems there. But I also think it's problematic because it's an implicit statement of you can't enjoy sex anymore, which is an assumption that people who don't have orgasms can't enjoy sex. There are lots of people who enjoy non-goal directed sex that doesn't involve orgasm, that makes them very happy. So you want to be careful if you're going to talk to a child about those kinds of costs. Then I think you want to say, look, there may be impacts on the way that you experience sexuality, such as potentially impacting your experiences of orgasm. So that doesn't necessarily mean that you can't have healthy, meaningful sexual relationships. So, like Callie's saying, even if we accept 100% for the sake of argument that both of these things is absolutely true, that's still part of the informed consent discussion. That's not, you can't use those to say, and therefore we're going to prevent these people from making these decisions, because, the idea that, they don't know what an orgasm is, we make medical decisions all the time without knowing the realities of what the counterfactuals would actually be like, or the cost would actually be like. And I think that's just the reality of us having to make decisions with imperfect knowledge. The important thing is, are we doing the best we can to make sure that we are providing what seems like the most healthy and effective care for these individuals?
This is obviously an explosive issue. We should acknowledge that for sure. Sure. I find even my own blood pressure rising when we discuss this. I care so much about protecting children from long-term psychological consequences as well as physical consequences. And I know you two do as well. I'm not pitting that against and saying you two don't care. Not saying that, to be clear, but it makes me. I'm so wary about being like your position, Aaron, which is like, oh yeah, NBD, no big deal. Like, this is I'm kind of like, you have your stance on this. I don't have my stance on this yet because I really don't know what the long-term psychological consequences are of making such a decision so young, in the sense that, like, we have rules, protections against children in lots of other ways. 12-year-olds, even if they want to consent to having sex with a 40-year-old, we say no. Like, yeah, that's fine, you're consenting to that, but no, like, that's bad for lots of reasons, including maybe your long-term psychological consequences. And you would say that's a false analogy. Yeah.
Because we do know, the level of, like, empirical scientific knowledge, I'm not the expert on that, but like, we do know for sure what the psychological effects of denying the reality of someone's trans identity can be. And it is often a dead kid. Like, and like, going back to the earlier thing, saying that that's an inevitability, obviously that's hyperbole. Obviously that's not true, but like, things very often do end up working out that way. And if not that, often long-term psychological damage, long-term trauma, like long-term life-altering trauma. And I think it is absolutely a valid question to talk about the possible negative effects of like moving forward with that medical intervention, for sure, because I think that's an important conversation with any medical intervention. But I think what is often lost in the conversation is doing nothing has a cost, and often a very incredibly high cost as well. And I think it's very important to not dismiss that part of it as well.
Hold on. I'm definitely thinking like a scientist right now. The alternative here is not to do nothing or to have them take puberty blockers. Here's an interesting question scientifically, because I think about studies in my head. Like, what is the statistically significant difference between doing a gender-affirming care in the sense of you change your pronouns, you do everything but the puberty blocker versus the puberty blockers in terms of suicides? That would be where my head goes in terms of I want to see that data, if that makes sense.
I mean, and that's complicated too, because not all trans people need or want hormones or surgeries or anything like that, right? So like, it's the difference between knowing that you need those things and not needing those things, right? Because for some people, it really is entirely about maybe like outward presentation, name, pronouns, that sort of stuff, and like that's all fine, and that's entirely valid, right? And so so when I say do nothing, I mean someone who says this is a medical intervention I need and refusing to give that
do nothing
to that
is refusing
like
to
not providing
in those specific circumstances where someone is saying this is something I need and you're saying no, we're not going to do that.
I see. It's not meaning completely ignoring the child's. You got you.
And can I push back a little bit? I don't know if this is.
Of course you can.
just phrasing a little bit in terms of like that we see this as no big deal. I think like there's a conflation sometimes that happens when someone is confident or has a settled position on something, that's the same as thinking that it's not a hard question or that there aren't important costs to every answer to that question, right?
Fair
like
enough.
if I've done enough, ethical parsing and stuff, and I come to a settled conclusion that like, affirming people's identities is the ethical thing to do, I think that like that's reasonable. And if you show me like an overwhelming, like if you showed me that like puberty blockers killed children, right? Like they just die, right? Like then I think you'd have a reasonable argument that it's immoral to prescribe puberty blockers to them, even if that would affirm their identity. But what I think we have is enough evidence to say there are some medical costs, but there are also some medical and psychological benefits. And that like, it's not no big deal, but it is progress in our understanding. And I think some people think that like we have to always be so open-minded to every possibility rather than coming to kind of settled conclusions. I also just want to say about the sex with children things, because this comes up so much when you start talking about child autonomy and medical ethics. Is that a constant
sort of like automatic kind of, you would call it a red herring perhaps?
Yeah, or a thought terminating cliche, or just like, it's just a bad argument, right? I don't need fallacy names to just say it's just a bad argument.
My argument was just a bad argument, Scott. Okay,
well, because, and like, why? We have, an abundance of evidence that like sex with underage individuals significantly harms them psychologically, right? Like we know this. It's an obvious fact.
Data on that, yeah.
Right. And so when we say you can't have sex with children even if they consent to it, we are, in a way being soft paternalistic, but because that is the right thing to do in that particular situation, it's a totally different cost benefit analysis when you're talking about a medical treatment.
Well, even if the data showed that it was okay, though, it's not like you would suddenly be like, okay, then there's justification for it.
Like if humans were a species, hypothetically, where we were sexually active from birth, right? And we were immediately functionally.
Where are you going with this, Aaron? I'm getting nervous. I feel like I know where you're going with this and I'm about to have a heart attack.
What I'm saying is you're asking me, what if humans were biologically different? Should we morally treat them differently? And I would say, yeah, like if different things are good for humans because they're a different species, then that's fine. We're still respecting autonomy, right? It was just, it's changing the shape of, like if we found out, for example, right, that like people are, there's no sexual cost, there's no cost to being sexually active at 16 instead of 20, right? Should we set the age of consent at 16 instead of 20, even though religious fundamentalists want to set it at, 25 or whatever? Yes. Like,
well, what about 12?
That's part of the cost benefit.
What about 12? No, that's my question. What about 12?
If you could really show that there's absolutely.
Yeah.
No, look.
You're 5 seconds from getting. Yeah, be straightforward.
What,
no, let him be straightforward. No, please let him answer. Please let him answer, Aaron. Answer.
I'm an ethicist. I'm not afraid of being canceled. You can't do anything
Aaron,
to me that
what
they
about
try
12?
To do Peter Singer.
Because that is my direct analogy is 12. So go
sure.
on.
Let's say that you had overwhelming evidence, contrary to all prior evidence, right? Contrary to the giant body of work that shows that this is bad for 12-year-olds. You had so many studies that suddenly proved that it was okay for 12-year-olds to have
psychologically,
sex. Yeah. Then if they are psychologically competent, which is what you've proven, right? Because there's no way that it's not causing harm if they are not psychologically competent, then yeah, they should be allowed to have sex.
With 40-year-olds?
Like, I think that's, it's about harm reduction, right? We set the age of consent because we are trying to protect people from harm. What other reason would there be?
Well, okay, so I disagree.
And I think what,
but yeah, go on.
And I think what Aaron was getting at earlier about the perception of having a settled conversation or a settled position being read as like a nonchalance about the position, and I think there's another piece of that I think is important to name in the sort of baggage that I'll just cop to like coming to conversations like this with, in that if I don't act that way, I know that people in bad faith will point to that and saying, well, look, even these activists aren't super sure of the things that they say, right? It's a rhetorical trap that is set for you, where if you are super sure and confident, you get painted as being like rigid and unflexible and not willing to consider outside viewpoints. But the minute you temper that position, it's like, well, even this person says there's an exception, so we can't know, because the argument works its way back to, in the case of affirming trans kids, for example, the argument works its way back to, and thus we shouldn't do any of this because we just can't know.
Well,
right.
My argument's different.
It's the argument for inaction. And I know that, but the problem that I end up being put in is knowing that you are not the only audience for this conversation.
Yeah, that's
right?
true.
And that's a thing. And that's a thing that I am forced to consider in situations like this.
Definitely.
Because that's a thing that often ends up happening is people taking your words out of context and using them against you, right?
Oh, yeah.
But like I can tell you, I've had lots of conversations with parents about their kids transitioning, and like it's not a thing to undertake lightly. And I don't think anyone actually thinks that. Like anyone who argues on the side of affirming trans kids thinks that it is a thing to take lightly. At least not people who have the authority to like actually affect the way that these things work out in the real world. Because I can point to all sorts of costs that have come with my own transition, but they're all costs that ended up being worth it for me.
Okay,
and they may not be for other people. So.
Great point. And I think, and I really respect that as a person who is an adult who made these decisions, who's capable of making a fully formed decision. The reason why I disagree for a number of reasons with what Aaron said, and I don't want to like double click on that again. The 13 and 4-year-old thing, that's a whole separate conversation. I think there are lots of issues surrounding why I don't think that's okay, not just for this particular reason of whether or not there's psychological harm. But I think that from a psychological perspective, from what I know about child development, at the age of 12, the prefrontal cortex is not fully developed. And it is important to recognize that a 12-year-old decision maker is not the same as an adult decision maker who's able to weigh a calculus in a mature way. And this does have very long-term consequences on them, this decision. I'm just taking it from that perspective.
So where would you set the age of medical consent then? I mean, to my knowledge, right, the prefrontal cortex stops developing around 25, right? Mm-hmm. So should my undergrads be denied informed consent? Like, because a lot of them have some impulse control problems. Let me tell you.
Well, and again, I would push back on that and say that like I agree with you. Yeah. Right. Yeah. But we're not talking about a situation in which we decide to not move forward with this and there are no consequences of that either. Right. We're talking about
that's true.
One set of potentially bad consequences against another set of horrifically bad consequences, right? Like we're not. I think there's a fundamental way that we treat this conversation that assumes there is no harm on the side of waiting and seeing. Forcing a kid to go through a puberty that is torturous for them, because it's not a choice between doing this and doing nothing that has no consequences, right? We are talking about the whatever potential long-term negative consequences there could be of puberty blockers, of cross-sex hormone therapy, of surgeries, whatever, versus the lifelong trauma that comes from denying a kid those things. Right. And I think that's the side that we are often leaving entirely out of the conversation.
Wait, there's something I don't know. Just you're going to have to explain this to me. Later on in life, you still can make decisions, medical decisions that help you have greater alignment. I'm trying to ask a really nuanced question. I'm trying to think how to articulate this. Like scientifically, what is the difference in mental well-being for those who have made this decision, that critical period around puberty, versus those who waited till they were adults and then had got on hormones and all these sorts of things? What is that's my question, I guess.
Well, especially for folks who go through a testosterone fueled puberty, there are a lot of things that you cannot undo from that process. I mean, you hear my voice, right? Like testosterone thickens your vocal cords in a way that
you have a great podcast
hormones
voice.
Does not. Thank you.
For what it's worth.
One of the reasons I've done it for a while, and actually one of the reasons why I've not like done voice therapy and tried to change the way that I talk, because I like my voice. But the fact is, like, testosterone fueled puberty thickened my vocal cords in a way that hormones does not reverse, and surgery cannot reliably reverse. And there are lots of other things like that there's kind of like no going back from if you go through puberty and wait to do any sort of medical intervention. Like, there are things from that cannot be reversed, especially like this is a very, very, very big oversimplification. But if you go through an estrogen-fueled puberty, testosterone will change more of your like physical characteristics than if you go through a testosterone-fueled puberty and do estrogen. Like I said, gross oversimplification, but like in a general sense, there are just changes that happen that aren't easily reversed.
Thank you. Yeah.
Or there's a really high cost to reversing them or something. And like, let's be honest, there's a cost of a psychological hell if you don't identify with your body in this kind of way. Like, I've talked to people who, for various reasons, felt in conflict with their bodies, and it's, you feel trapped inside of a thing that is like fighting you in this kind of way, and that's a really horrible experience for people, and you shouldn't be forced to suffer through that for 5-6 years before you get to be treated like somebody who knows the inside of their own mind. I understand being concerned about children not always understanding the complexities of all these kinds of trade-offs. But like, if it's cancer treatment, nobody's batting an eye about whether, a young cancer patient gets to have cancer treatment, even though, let me tell you, the effects of cancer treatment look really similar in some ways to the effects of hormone treatment, like sterility and things like that.
Interesting. I would actually frame it different, that they're in conflict with their bodies. In a way, I would say they're in conflict with the way they want to be perceived by society, in a way that isn't more in alignment with who they are, or who they feel like they are.
I think some of them identify as just like being in conflict with their bodies, like phantom limb syndrome kind of stuff.
Trans identity is complicated and nuanced in a way that, like, there are pieces of that are true, because sometimes it is, fundamentally about a difference in the way people treat us versus the way that we want people to be treated. But also some people feel that it is a very inherent, like, inborn thing of who they are. And all of that experience is valid, I think.
Which is not a soul. People always say, oh, you're saying there's a gendered soul. No, we're saying people have a first person subjective experience that is persistent over time.
What do you think about, but I hate that account, Libs of TikTok. I finally got banned by them. It's just straight up bullying. But they do sometimes show videos of teachers who say things to their students, who teach things such as gender is all about how you feel, and it can change 5 times a day. One mood might be male gender, one mood might be female gender. Now, do you love that? Or do you watch those videos from teachers and you're like, yes, they should be teaching that in the schools? Like, I want to hear your perceptions of that.
I mean, I just want more context. I don't trust anything that
coming
comes
from that side.
Right.
And that's
like,
fair.
Well, because there's a world in which I am cheering that on because gender identity is an inherently personal thing, and it shifts for people over time sometimes, and that's great. I love that. That's fine. We should absolutely be affirming and encouraging that.
Yeah, sorry, my mind just got blown, and because I really want to understand in Callie's worldview how you can reconcile allowing a person to make such a radical decision, such as take testosterone boosters, but also recognizing that if it's just a mood, that like maybe 2 years from now they'll have a different mood. Like, how do you reconcile those two things?
I definitely didn't say it was just a mood.
Oh, okay. Okay, so you would push back.
What I
That's
think
specifically
it is,
what I said about teachers who say it's a mood. Yeah.
I think it's well, and that's why I said I would need context, right? And I would need to know like
more of what
is
means
actually being said, right?
Okay.
Because I'm certainly guilty of saying things like that in conversation, flippantly, like, like I love making I saw a sign that was like, man, woman, ATM. Ah, yes, the 3 genders, right? And I could imagine someone taking a video of me saying that out of context to make it sound like it way more than something that it actually is, right? I think it is true that people's visions of themselves and their identities change over time. It is not as equally true that people feel the need for some sort of big like physical intervention like hormones or surgeries, and that changes over time. Like I think those are fundamentally different concepts, and I don't think it is I don't think it's reasonable to compare those things as being equally fluid to one another, because that's just not the way that it generally works out, I don't think.
And I think the reality can be, for some people, their gender identity is very stable. For other people, it's more fluid. And like, that's just the reality of gender. As for like education, I think that we should be teaching about gender in schools, just like I think we should be teaching about critical race theory in schools. I think I can find you plenty of examples of teachers teaching them terribly and like causing harm by doing so, just like I can find you examples of them teaching anything terribly and causing harm. But by and large, I think people are teaching these things in ways that are positive and a significant improvement. Look, just like you were saying, I might say something wrong. I apologize if I screw this up. And like on the other side of the spectrum are the really, really woke people who really want to do the right thing and are saying really, really wrong things because they think that's what they need to be saying to help people. Right. And like, they need to be corrected too. They need to be helped, but like, they're not monsters. They're not trying to ruin children or something like that. They're not trying to groom your children. They're just trying to do what everybody's trying to do, which is be good people and help people live better lives.
Yeah. Good intentions can be paved with hell, is like, that's the famous expression.
Sure. Right.
But
Aaron, that doesn't mean you can't talk about gender in schools.
Wait, Aaron, so do you not view yourself as woke? If you're not woke, then
I absolutely identify as woke. Oh no,
okay,
I identify as woke, but I also think there are like extreme versions of wokeness.
I thought you were talking about those woke people, and I'm like, Aaron, what are you?
No, I was criticizing members of my own community, as we should do.
Wow.
I just absolutely hate that term and the way
I understand.
That it has
the
way it's weaponized,
because it's a horribly misappropriated use of the word, the way that it was initially introduced to be used.
Absolutely,
I think,
true.
Yeah. And I think using it that way is allowing people of bad faith to steer the conversation in a way that I'm not comfortable with.
Well, here's what I'll say. I think there is something called wokeness, which is a cultural phenomenon that manifests in various different ways. And I think it's worth talking about that phenomenon while also acknowledging that the term has been misappropriated from marginalized communities. So I think there's a difference between saying this word is being misused and saying this is not actually a thing. I 100% think it is a thing. I think it's often weaponized, and there's no discussion about like, here is functional wokeness and here is dysfunctional wokeness. It's treated as if like anyone who fits this category is this extreme thing, which I don't think is a useful way to have a conversation.
Yeah, no, I have made that point on my podcast before about the woke. I just don't like reducing anyone to a specific ideology, because I may agree with a lot of things some so-called woke people say and disagree with a lot of things some so-called woke people say. What does that make me? Aren't we allowed? I think we need to open up more of a space for people.
I'm a pluralist. I identify with a lot of ideologies. So I'm woke, I'm progressive.
There you go. We need to open up that space for people to mix and match and be free thinkers and be
we
free
call it
thinkers.
intersectionality over in woke world.
Well, I was gonna say you sound very woke when you said you're like we should teach critical race theory in schools. I mean, that's a whole other podcast that we could do, and we're not gonna do that right now.
But I bring it up because the trans panic is very connected to the queer theory moral panic in schools is being pushed by the exact same people who push the critical race theory moral panic.
That is very true. That is very true. So let me wrap up today. Something that a point I've been wanting to make for the past hour and a half. I'm just keeping it in my head to the right time to make it. You said something earlier that I really resonated with. I do think people need to recognize that words can have multiple meanings. People are being so strict in their, biologists are like, no, sex means, it's like, gender means, it's like, okay, I think and this is where I do get some arguments with some of my biologist colleagues. I'm like, words can have multiple meanings. And I make it analogous to the world upon which I've studied of intelligence the past 20 years and trying to redefine intelligence beyond an IQ test. And you made a really interesting point earlier about like, the biology stuff, the going to this is sex a binary kind of connotes there's kind of this implicit assumption, well, the sex is the real thing and the gender identity is the fake thing. And I thought that was a really good point. So I wanted to end here on that agreement because it'd be the same thing for like someone who's evidently smart, brilliant, and then a school psychologist says like, well, let me measure your IQ, and they're like, you're not really smart because your IQ does not indicate that. And that's something I've been challenging my whole career. So I see something analogous to what you all are saying and what a lot of people in the trans community are saying, which is they're trying to broaden our notion of what gender could be and how we view that and the kind of the malleability of it. Love it or hate it, I see what you're saying. And I really appreciate you coming on my show today and presenting your perspectives. Thank you so much.
The term for that, by the way, is essentially contestable concepts.
There you go.
Like fairness, right? There's no one definition of
fairness.
fairness.
Leave it to the philosopher, too.
Right, several competing definitions of fairness. I also, before we run out of time, I just have to say, I find it really frustrating because I know you were trying to get this to be potentially a conversation across the aisle, that a lot of the folks in this debate from the anti-trans or whatever we want to call them, TERF, gender-affirming, gender critical. Right. Most of them, many of them like Matt Walsh will say no one will debate me on these topics. But as I think you discovered, it was actually rather difficult.
I couldn't do
one
it.
of them
couldn't find.
Right. And I'm here to debate any of these people. Callie doesn't love that nearly as much. I love it. I'm fine to do it.
You're
I
not
think
trans.
It's worth doing.
Hold on, you're not trans, and maybe that does mean something because I've talked to a number of trans individuals. Would you talk to and I mentioned someone in the gender critical community, and most of them, all of them, I couldn't find one that didn't say, you know what, I don't feel like that's going to be good faith, and you can sort of see it from their perspective as well of like, sure. I have to defend my existence again, that's exactly and I think that's what I'm hearing.
And that's why I'm here to
I feel like I want to stand up for the trans community with what you just said, Aaron. That's so funny.
Well, but I mean, so I had a lengthy exchange with Andy Lewis on LetterWiki, and it got picked up by the anti-trans community and the pro-trans community. And the pro-trans community, some of them were a little anxious that two cis dudes were arguing about trans issues, and other ones were like, well, Aaron does a lot of debate with people like this. Let's wait and see. And most of them were, almost all of them were extremely happy with how it went. And like part of my defense of that behavior is there aren't that many trans people. And if they're the only ones who are allowed to argue these things, that's a big burden on their community. I think it's okay if I have done the work and am responsible about not throwing that community under the bus as a debate tactic, that I can help. Like, I think that's fine.
There's a fundamental understanding of like when I say like as a blanket thing that like I'm uncomfortable with cis people debating trans stuff, it's not because they're cis, right? It's because very often when I see cis people debating trans stuff, they do a horrible job of it, right? Like it's just there's that like second half of it often goes unsaid. I would actually love for cis people like Aaron, who have done the work, who have done the reading, who know what they're talking about, who do a good job, to more often take those things up, right? My hesitation is not actually to do with the fact that he's not trans. My hesitation is that very often cis people have not done the work to understand what things actually are.
I did not mean to denigrate Aaron's spectacular reasoning and ability to be
I'm just a scrapper.
No, I get it.
We were spokesperson for the trans community. You
were being very anti-cis.
Yeah,
I'm gonna
being very woke.
That's so funny that I ended up being the woke point. To be very clear, my point is I would genuinely like to see more of open, honest, respectful discussions between trans people and the gender critical people. I want to double click on that particular combination and say I would like to see more of that. I don't even know if it's possible, but hopefully I'm doing this whole series where people can at least listen to people's perspectives that may be different from each other, even though they're not all intersecting with each other. Thank you both so much. You are both obviously very, very thoughtful, compassionate individuals who've thought about this for far longer than I have. So thank you so much for being on the show today.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for the really great chat.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Psychology Podcast. If you'd like to react in some way to something you heard, I encourage you to join in the discussion at thepsychologypodcast.com or on our YouTube page, The Psychology Podcast. We also put up some videos of some episodes on our YouTube page as well, so you'll want to check that out. Thanks for being such a great supporter of the show, and tune in next time for more on the mind, brain, behavior, and creativity.